Welcome to Alberta Conservation Association's Harvest Your Own podcast, the resource for everything hunting, navigating through the field, the butcher shop, and the kitchen. Life is all about great food. Let's get started.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Brad Fenson, an avid outdoor enthusiast who has worked as a freelance journalist, photographer, and public speaker for over 3 decades. I have hunted, fished, and foraged all my life and hope to share my passion for the outdoors. Along the way, I want to encourage everyone to harvest wild proteins and enjoy the satisfaction of providing the next meal for your family. Our goal is to educate, entertain, and inspire individuals to get outdoors and create a connection between food, health, and your future meals. Welcome to Harvest Your Own. Today, we have a senior scientist and wildlife program manager from the ACA, Alberta Conservation Association, and it's Doug Manzer. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Brad. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We've had you here before talking about gray partridge, which I think is probably one of your favorite things.
It's certainly one of my favorite birds to hunt. And in fact, we ate it last night for dinner. We had 3 partridge and they're just delicious.
They are. They are wonderful birds that are worthy of extra days in the field.
Oh, they are. Yeah. Wonderful.
You know, on the lines of upland game birds, let's talk about the biggest one that occurs in Alberta these days, the Merriam's turkey.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's another favorite subject.
Let's look at the history of turkeys in Alberta. Were they here long term?
No, they haven't been here really long term, but they've been here for, over 60 years now. So they were introduced into Alberta in 1962. And they were brought into the Cypress Hills originally. And then after the population just started to kick off, there was a relocation to the Porcupine Hills, I think about 10 or 11 years after that. And then I think there was another population or a small group that was brought in from another jurisdiction in the States somewhere in those first 10 years. But really since then, the population we have today is built up from that.
Right. So we have little pockets of birds, or historically we've had these pockets. What have other jurisdictions done to augment populations? Do they do an initial release? I mean, wild turkey management across North America is pretty interesting because they're a success story. Their populations have soared over the last 100 years. They were almost extirpated in some areas. They were extirpated. They've been reintroduced in a lot of places, some successfully, some with moderate results, and some lacking in result.
Yes, the history is very rich on this. And a lot of the early work that was done was with pen-rear birds to try and kick off turkey, populations across the states. And to a large extent, those did not work. And right after the Second World War, there was a lot more attention put on translocating wild birds and trying to jumpstart populations in many states to the south of us. And the ones that have been really successful, probably the key thing that really helped particular jurisdictions to really kick off their turkeys was to keep those translocations up year over year over year. And then once those small subpopulations started to grow within state, they would then relocate, 10 and 20 birds just to another location within the state and start off by having a pocket full of subpopulations to dozens of populations and then even hundreds of subpopulations. And there are some jurisdictions in the states where there are, many hundreds of thousands of birds. So it's Alberta, even though we have turkeys today, we didn't sort of carry that on. We didn't do the translocations many years on the trot at the outset, and we didn't keep up with relocations. And I think we're probably suffering some of the outcome of that now.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I've hunted Nebraska, Oklahoma, and I know that they've done translocations every county. They move it here to the next valley, to the next set of hills, to where there's the next change in habitat. And where the habitats change, they might actually introduce another subspecies or species of turkey that would do better there. And you end up with hybrids on the edges, but their turkey populations grow very well.
Yeah, and so that has been a strategy in many cases, and it's not like there's always going to be ups and downs with wildlife populations, and there's some jurisdictions in the states where the recruitment of turkeys has even started to go down over the last 10 or 15 years. And so they're still trying to find that equilibrium over time, because there is that, sometimes there's a bit of a founder's effect when this occurs and your population sort of explodes for 10 or 15 years. It gets to a peak and then it starts to dampen off. So they're still trying to find where that balance is. But we're talking about tens of thousands of birds as opposed to hundreds of birds now.
Yeah, hundreds of birds. But, if you look at jurisdictions next to us, BC has a wonderful population and it's well established. It's very well distributed. We can go to southern Manitoba, find the same. We can go to Ontario, Quebec. Those populations never existed in the past either. They were created. Do you know if they did build a population, use part of it to spread it out across those provinces?
So I don't know that I don't believe British Columbia did that. I think they might have had some relocations, but I'm not sure about that. And I don't think I could say about Manitoba. I think there has been programs in Manitoba where they have done relocations over the last 20 years, but I don't know the details of it. Yeah.
So it's interesting because we are probably right on the northern edge of the habitats they can survive in. And it's not so much the habitat, but it's our winters.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not like Manitoba doesn't have a severe winter, but there are food resources that, say, Manitoba, I believe, has like masting species from oak trees and so on that might be an advantage for nutrition, food resources. And even on the British Columbia side, there might be some advantages as well. There's some evidence that they'll eat sort of the nuts off of ponderosa pine cones and that sort of thing. So there's some of these associations, but that's not to think that our, Merriam's birds in Alberta can't do well here. I think one of the key issues we've had over the last 20 years is that we just have very small populations in many cases. And then over time, they don't really have the ability to rescue another population or another group of 20 birds if those populations are spread 10, 15, even 30 kilometers apart.
Yeah, they're very isolated. So there is nothing that can creep in from the edges. And, it's interesting you say that because I hear it all the time. And when I'm in the States hunting birds, they talk about gobblers that go on a wander, had a bunch of big birds move in that we've never seen before, or we have a bunch of Merriams where we normally see Easterns, and wild turkeys are wild. So they do naturally distribute and spread new genes and maybe bolster populations that didn't have enough toms to breed all the hens, but that's something that they would do naturally if the birds were widespread across the landscape.
Right. Yeah, and we've seen that as well. Like we did do some translocations last winter, and we saw birds end up a long ways away in some cases from where we originally released them, and in some cases into the forestry zones, the green zones, far away from any source of food that they might be able to attain in wintertime. So they can go on a wander.
They certainly can. So it's interesting. Alberta established their first turkeys in 1962, and we basically sat and watched them for 60 years.
Right.
And then I guess you decided, and ACA, other managers, I know that the turkey management plan took decades to get approved. And here we are, 60 years later, we're finally looking at new translocations of birds.
Yeah. So when we had a number of groups and people come to us over the last, at least 10 years that were bringing forward this idea that there needs to be something done with turkeys. We're not really sure what's going on with turkeys. Is the population is okay or is it not? So we started looking at the numbers of turkeys or ways to try and figure out whether the population is stable or going up and down in 2021. And as you can imagine, turkeys are actually fairly difficult to survey with any degree of accuracy. So the way that we did this is we reached out to landowners all the way from, say, Longview to Cardston. And we sort of broke it up into 5 or 6 zones and tried to get a minimum number of landowners in each of those zones to sort of report back and let us know what has happened with turkeys over the last 10 years, 20 years, and the last year. And every time we would talk to someone who who was from a particular zone, we'd also ask them if they could recommend anyone else that we could talk to, so we could try and figure out where these pockets of turkeys existed. And what we found to a large extent is many of these areas had turkeys, at least at some point over the last, say, 40 years. But in many cases, since the early 2000s, many of those populations have winked out, or they've got down from, say, 20, 30, 40 birds, maybe in the early 2000s, down to, 2, 3, or 4 birds. And it's been this sort of slow decline over that period of time. So we've been going back to those landowners each year now since 2021. This will be the 4th year that we'll be doing this. And, we're trying to get a read on what the trajectory of those populations are doing. And for the first 3 years, they were still going down. Now, these types of surveys aren't robustly accurate, because you're asking people to report on how many birds they would normally have in their yard if they're feeding cattle, that sort of things. And so people are going to get that probably within a, maybe plus or minus 5, depending on how many are there. But we also have, there are particular cases in certain areas where there's more birds, where you could get a bit of overlap between two landowners that might be, having the same birds come on their land.
Yeah, easily.
So we've tried to take that into account, but in general, the numbers have been going down. So if our numbers are close to being accurate, we started off with around 840 birds, maybe in 2021, and last year we were down to, I think, mid 600s.
Wow.
This podcast is produced for Harvest Your Own, a program dedicated to those who want to reconnect with food and health through their experiences outdoors. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a resource for individuals to learn more about hunting and the outdoors. There's information to get you started and ensure that your compass stays pointed in the right direction to be successful. Where's your next meal coming from?
Well, it is pretty good information, though, in terms of historical establishment and where birds could survive. And there's lots of reasons why they could have dropped below a threshold to maintain that little pocket of population.
Right. And so there are areas where we have, landowners that might have over 100 birds on their properties in wintertime. And so that's still occurring right now. And those are kind of core areas that are sort of keeping the whole population afloat right now, and probably has done so for a number of years. But then we have other areas where, it used to be 20 birds and, there's either no birds or just a couple. So those are the areas that we're really focusing on building up at this point.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting. I know that I also wrote some news pieces about asking Alberta citizens and hunters, like, if you see a turkey, tell us where it was and what time of year, what day it was.
Yeah, we are always interested in that information. On the off chance that it's in a location that we don't know about at this point in time, we definitely would like people to call in with that. And we run a brood survey in the summertime, which really starts off in July, and we run it through to October. And we're asking that anyone who sees turkeys to report them on our website. We've got just a really straightforward form that's on there that you can just click and load up. And we just really want to know how many poults and how many hens you might see that are out there. And if you don't know how to identify them as that, you just put them in as unknown.
Right.
But, that's the sort of information we're looking for right now. And that, we call that a brood survey, but that brood survey is really important for us to try and get a better read on the recruitment and whether or not the recruitment is sort of keeping the population afloat or not.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've done all the groundwork, the legwork, to understand the turkeys before you make any moves on the land to bring more in. Throwing stuff into a bottomless hole is not going to help.
Well, so it may or may not help. I think we are taking the position that it's very likely that turkeys can do well in Alberta. We're never going to figure out at this stage, with this few birds we have, like, it's hard to detect exactly why they haven't done well, but we can take a pretty good guess at it. And if we just imagine that you've got these small populations, you can think of them as being a small population problem. Because when you get groups of birds that are 5, 10, even 20 birds, if that group is isolated from another group by, say, 30 kilometers, it's hard for another bird to even find that group.
Absolutely. And
especially if you have toms that are, say, toms are not there or not old enough to breed the hens, then you easily could go for a season 2, 3, or 4 where the hens in that valley might not be reproductively successful.
Pretty hard to maintain a population. I mean, how long does a turkey live in the wild on average?
Well, several years. I mean, on average, I guess, I don't know the number off on average, but it takes them like a hen has to be in her second year to breed.
Yeah.
And they won't breed with jakes, the first year jakes. So you need to have a male that's at least 2 years old to actually be considered a viable male. So unlike a lot of our other galliforms that will breed in their first year, turkeys don't. So they need a little bit more care and attention when it comes to maintaining some age structure in that, well, both the male and the female population.
Yeah, that's interesting because we might see turkeys, but if there's no breeding toms in the population, it can't grow. And any predation or weather events or other things that could take birds out of that population is going to mean it eventually decreases to the point where it can't be sustained.
Right. It's a little bit more delicate, and I think jurisdictions across North America have found that. There are some, it takes some real care and attention to try and manage those different age structures in that population to make sure it's successful. And an example that I had in the valley where I live a couple of years ago, I had a pretty good idea how many toms were in our valley. Just because you could go out there and you can gobble, you can hear the different ones respond. But I think we had probably 3 adult age toms and 2 jakes. But I know by the end of the second day, those 3 toms were taken. So that was on like May 2nd.
Wow. When
that happened. And, the hens haven't been bred by then. Like the initiation date for hens is later in the month of May. So for those females to actually breed now, there's going to have to be another male that would move into that valley, or they're going to have to go looking. So there's some, like when you have small populations like that, where there's not a large number of toms that could come in and take over, it's a real challenge to manage that.
That's interesting. I know that some of the seasons are set in the States to ensure that a lot of the breeding is done before hunting occurs, but I didn't realize that our nesting was that late in the season in Alberta. But again, a function of being at the northern extent of their range where they can survive and have ever survived.
Yeah, and it's this topic we're talking about right now is not resolved in many jurisdictions across North America. It is being looked at very closely because there's a lot of locations where there might be issues with the timing of hunting versus the breeding season. So, and here, just in general with our galliforms, our ground nesting birds, grouse-like birds, pheasants, partridge, lots of those initiation dates, and that's basically when they first start to put an egg in a nest, is likely going to be after the 15th of May. It's probably going to be around, sometime between the 15th and the 30th. Let's just take a guess and say it's the 20th. Yep. Well, that hen needs to be bred for her to have a fertilized egg in that nest. And so that's one of the challenges with being at the northern extent of the range. And some of the turkey populations that are, much further south, they might have initiation dates. So the first egg in the nest well ahead of us, maybe a month or more ahead of us, most likely. So it's a matter of trying to fix that timing or understand that timing and how it plays out.
It's a very interesting biology of the bird. Understanding the bird is key to keeping it here. So 60 years, we've had turkeys. They've had good times. They're not doing so great right now. The number of things from winters and predation and split populations, they're struggling to survive. Is that the best way to put it?
I think so, yeah. And certainly in certain areas, they're really struggling. Well, let me reverse that. In a few areas, they're doing well. But in most of the areas across their distribution in southwestern Alberta, they're not doing well or haven't been doing well.
Right. Yeah. So 21, you started looking at things, and last year you started basically a reintroduction of birds from other locations. Let's start with, how did you find birds to even bring into Alberta?
That was not easy. So we reached out to many jurisdictions in North America asking the question if they'd be willing to provide birds. And we, in the southwestern Alberta, we have Merriam's turkeys, and many jurisdictions have Merriam's, and British Columbia was open to the idea of us bringing in birds from British Columbia into Alberta. But the caveat to that was that these birds had to be in a sense, problem birds. So birds that are in sort of urban areas, which are not really out there in the wild or even living in the ranch land. So last year, 2023, and again this winter, we've had, teams of people, crews basically working in these small, well, not so small in some cases, towns and villages in southeastern British Columbia, removing problem birds from around acreages and literally right close to the library, in some cases. And so these are town birds, which we're taking from British Columbia, and we have a strict quota, and we're really limited in places where we can take them. And then we'll get them disease tested. Every bird that comes in is disease tested. We'll only accept birds that haven't come back with a negative report on that. And then we bring them in and we put them with host locations here in Alberta. And a host location is essentially a place that has some form of winter food that's available to the birds. Because we believe that winter is likely a time of year when they really do need to rely to a large extent on some form of food provided by humans. So that would be food, and as an example, that would be when you're feeding your cattle. They might be out there trying to pick up the grain that the cattle either haven't eaten or would even be in their feces. Right. So they can just pick the barley, right out of a cow flop or something like that.
So it's very important to have landowners that are understanding and willing to have birds on the landscape, because obviously one of the most limiting factors is winter and food sources. And if they're congregating around cattle operations or where there's spilt grain or other things from agricultural activities, that is really key for them surviving.
Yeah, it really is. And, we've been very pleasantly surprised by how the overwhelming, the people out there on the landscape and how, excited they are to get turkeys back out there, because many of these families grew up with turkeys when they were kids, and they might have lost them sometime in the last 20 years, and they're very excited to get them back on that ranch site. So it's been really overwhelming, I guess, in a sense, the excitement that you get when people say, geez, we'd like to get turkeys on our place again now too.
Yeah, it's nice that wildlife has that extreme value with people, especially rural Albertans nowadays. Not that urban people don't appreciate it, but, they were here once. My dad talked about them. My grandpa talked about them. We'd sure like to have them back.
Yeah, and they grew up maybe with them in the backyard when they were, maybe heading off to school in the morning. They'd see turkeys that were wandering along the fence. And getting those birds back again, that's so cool to many of these folks.
This podcast was made possible by Alberta Conservation Association and the Harvest Your Own community. If you're interested in harvesting your own food, there's a comprehensive collection of information. To gain insight and knowledge, head to the field, harvest your own protein, prepare it, and taste the results. HarvestYourOwn.ca is a library of information, from getting started and geared up to processing, butchering, and cooking wild game, to make the connection between health and food.
So last year you started. Tell us how it kicked off and what happened.
Right. Last year we focused our efforts in Invermere and Radium, and altogether we were able to capture and bring into Alberta 187 birds.
Not bad.
Yeah, it was a very good year. Yep. And we distributed those birds primarily between, say, the Crow's Nest River in the south up to Longview in the north, and we distribute them at these host locations. And then this year, we're doing more or less the same thing, but in different communities in southern British Columbia. So we have been in Kimberley, or the Kimberley area, for the last month or so. And we're now moving a little bit further north. And Windermere, I think we were in last week. And we'll probably continue on for the next 2 or 3 more weeks. I think as of tomorrow, we're going to release another 20 birds or so into Alberta. But we've caught 149 so far.
So 186 last year and 149 so far in 2014 or 2024.
Right. Yeah. 187 last year and 149 so far. We're going to try and get, if the communities can support them, we'll get up to hopefully about 200. Right. That's the goal for this year. And the idea is really is not to take our foot off the pedal. It's to continue on with this sort of approach, whether it's British Columbia or other areas where we're able to source birds, is to keep bringing in and translocating birds and starting off these small subpopulations, ideally for the next 9 to 10 years. That's the sort of effort we're planning on.
That's what's been successful in other jurisdictions. You have to be committed. It's not a one-time thing.
Absolutely. And North Carolina is a great example of this. They have a really good population down there, and they really started to take this translocation activity to heart in the 1970s, and they kept it up for, I believe, 20 years. And one of the other key things is not just to bring in translocated birds, because those can be difficult to source. You need a donor area to get them from, but to do relocations within your own jurisdiction. So once you have a population that's doing well from growth from within, so they're having recruitment, and once that, if we drop off, say, 20 birds at one location this year, if over the next 4 or 5 years that goes from 20 up to 50 or 60, it would be to come in and then selectively take birds out of that area, maybe another 20 birds, and then jumpstart another sub-community that's 10 or 20 kilometers away.
Absolutely. And if that actually works in Alberta, which I really hope it does, would you actually hit a point in time where you could actually not just look at the historic areas and maybe move them into the parkland?
Oh, I think so. I think there could be some natural movement going north. I mean, we do have evidence and reports of, turkeys that are as far north as Cochrane and that sort of area. And there was a bird, I think, in downtown Calgary a couple of years ago. And we are certainly trying to source birds right now, and we're trying to source eastern turkeys to try and bring into central Alberta at some point in time. The turkey management plan for Alberta, sort of points out that we would like to have turkeys not just in the southwest, but in other areas. But we need to find easterns to give the turkeys the best chance of surviving a little bit further north.
And that's because they've proven themselves to be winter hardy and more versatile in diet?
I think they're considered to be more hardy, and areas where they are located in eastern Canada and the eastern United States, they seem to be doing extremely well. It's not that Merriams wouldn't do well in those areas. It's just that Merriams are thought to be a bird that maybe aren't quite as hardy in winter. But in another sense, there are Merriam's turkeys in Manitoba, and I don't know, is Manitoba colder than here? I think it might be.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting you say that because, like I said, I've hunted turkeys in a number of states, and they have sometimes 4 species.
Right.
4 species with hybrids at least. And that's, some of them thrive in river valleys, others will thrive in pine hills and on the edge of mountains, but you don't see all of them in one spot. So finding diversity within the species to put into different habitats could be a key to establishing populations in different habitat types in Alberta.
Yeah, I think so. And it's one of those things where it'll be a bit of an experiment, especially if, depending on how far we were to move north with this. But we have landowners that are willing to play host, further north, between Edmonton and sort of the Calgary area, but a little bit to the east. And, it's surprising when you reach out and you ask people if they'd like to have turkeys in the area, the response almost invariably is yes.
Yes. It's interesting. It's got to be fairly costly.
It is. Yeah. So a program like this, where we have a lot of staff involved, a lot of time on the road, we're involved with this, intensive relocation program or translocation program. The actual trapping occurs over 2 months in winter, but there's many months of preparation on an annual basis to do this. So, it's one of those 6-figure projects.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know you've had some support from the conservation and hunting community within Alberta. I know Safari Club International out of Calgary and a host of different fish and game clubs have come up with some funding to help.
Yeah, it's been really well supported at the grassroots level from the interest groups that you're talking about, fish and game clubs from many different clubs across the province and SCI. And, what we're really looking for, I guess, is for that support to continue over time and to try and, I guess, be consistent year to year to give this program the best opportunity for success. I think one of the things that we could look at in future, which would be sort of an added expense, but I think probably worth it, is to put radio collars on birds so we can have a better understanding of not only what their survival is for the different age classes, in particular females, but also what the recruitment is. So more accurately dial in on what the success is and the number of poults per hen that are being produced out there in Alberta. And we do have information that's coming in from the brood surveys that I mentioned. But that information right now, we just haven't got the sample size for those to be robust estimates. But the numbers we're getting back suggest that our recruitment is still below where it needs to be. And it has been over the last 3 years that we've been collecting these data. So getting collars on birds and being able to accurately measure this would be a real advantage.
Wow. It's nice to see support from the different communities, but we'll go back to the survey. Citizen science can still help you and play a role in this as well.
Absolutely. In fact, we're really relying on that. I mean, right now, that is the best information we have, at least in terms of understanding what our winter count and location or distribution of turkeys is coming from landowners that have those turkeys on their place.
Yeah. So there you go. Anyone listening that wants to help, you can go and drive around in turkey country and record where you're seeing them, report them to the Alberta Conservation Association. If you're not involved with a conservation or hunting organization, get involved. If you're looking for a reason to do some fundraising, establishing turkeys across Alberta might just be the thing that checks off all those wonderful boxes for you as a volunteer.
Absolutely. And if you get out in the early season, maybe you're a bow hunter and you're hunting in the 300 zones and you're out there in September and October and you come across turkey observations, we'd really like you to go onto our website and report those observations. So if you're out there mule deer hunting or elk hunting, whitetails, whatever you're doing, you're likely to encounter them in many places in the Southwest, or at least you have an opportunity to see them.
Correct. Still in the Cypress Hills as well?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe we've had any birds in the Cypress Hills for, I would want to think, 5 or 6 years.
Wow. Yeah. That goes back to speaking about creating all those localized populations within a community, just a couple miles apart where they can help each other out, or you have a mature bird that can move in to maintain birds over time.
Yeah. And I think, so usually people ask, so how do these things die? Why are they winking out in places? And so there are these small population problems when they're sort of distributed and they're wide apart. But in any one situation, you can have a particular predator, like say a female cougar, which really decides she likes to eat turkey. And if she only wants to eat turkey once a month, then she takes 12 birds a year. But that valley where she primarily resides only had 20 to begin with. Well, you could have the birds in that valley wink out within a relatively short period of time. Yeah. But the truth is that when you think of them across a broad landscape, that's not necessarily going to happen everywhere. So you need many subpopulations and close enough together that when that happens, hopefully she'll start turning her attention to some other food source. And you can have, other birds that'll come in there and start to support that 2 or 3 years later.
Right. Well, this is a very interesting project. I know that a lot of people are watching it carefully. My friend Jim Clark has been a proponent of turkeys and pushed it for years. So I know he's over the moon that things are happening, and we're glad you're working on it. You have a full staff that's committed to making the turkey translocations work, and we hope that in 10 years' time we see big results on the landscape.
Well, thanks, Brad, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. And yeah, Jim was really instrumental in getting a lot of this off the ground. So thanks, Jim.
Yeah. Thanks for coming out today. We appreciate the information, and we're always looking for things to share with our listeners, and Alberta turkeys are big news.
Okay, thank you.
We hope to inspire people to reconnect with nature and appreciate where your food comes from by harvesting your own. For more information on getting started or to learn specifics about the Field to Fork experience, visit harvestyourown.ca and follow on Facebook and Instagram. Check back often for new material, recipes, and videos that are posted regularly. Please subscribe to Harvest Your Own podcast and take the time to rate and review the show to help us build a dedicated core of passionate hunters as our regular audience. Until next time, embrace the outdoors and all it has to offer. Thanks for joining us.